Jack, you I saw once again on your story that you have gone somewhere.
I have. I was in Eugene, Oregon this past weekend, just for the day, for a relatively hastily prepared trip to Eugene, as I mentioned, for the Prefontaine Classic track meet, which is an annual race. It usually happens in Eugene, but this is the first time since I believe 2018 that it is back in Eugene because they just opened a new stadium there. I have to say it was a wonderful experience. The entire trip, not only the meet, but I got to fly some pretty cool planes and on some pretty cool flights throughout the day. Um, it
Yeah, I saw on your Insta you said that like your flight was that this time that your flight was like the best ever
yeah,
that you've
yeah.
experienced?
So like generally, it would have been a lot easier for us to fly nonstop from San Francisco to Eugene and Eugene to San Francisco, but wanting to save money and not spend out a lot of money because the flight back from Eugene was really expensive if we were doing nonstop. So we instead just flew Alaska to Seattle and then Seattle, San Francisco, and that was on a Q400 prop plane, which I was really looking forward to for some reason, but it was super cool because the flight attendants were extraordinarily friendly. The plane was retrofitted apparently, which I didn't even know was a thing, but it looked super nice. And we'd also booked a basic economy ticket, but for some reason they only let you pick in the back of the plane, which happens to be the best seats on a Q400 because you don't have the propeller obstructing your view. So we ended up with really good seats, uh, and sat next to some really nice people who were also at the track meet. So all in all, it was really nice.
So I mean, when you were in Eugene, were you competing?
No, I wish. These were pro athletes. A lot of them were just in the Olympics, so a lot of fast times all around.
Oh, wow.
Because this meet's pretty prestigious. It's in what's like called the Diamond League, so it gives you a lot of prize money if you do well. So it attracts some big names.
Wow. It's very fancy. And wait, sorry. So what kind of plane did you fly again?
So the flight from San Francisco to Eugene on the way there, that was United. It was a Steer J200, so pretty small. The
Mhm.
flight from Eugene.
You saw which one the prop plane? Was that a Horizon?
Yeah,
A
it was
Horizon or
Horizon from Eugene to Seattle, and like I mentioned, it was recently retrofitted. And then the flight from Seattle to San Francisco, I believe I actually never really checked, but I believe it was an A320. It was either an A319 or an A320, formerly Virgin America. So it had Alaska's updated interior, which is also pretty nice. It doesn't have in-flight entertainment screens, but it has some tablet holders and mood lighting, and it's well designed. So yeah, it was good.
that's cool. I still have not flown since last September. It's been almost a year since I've flown.
And have you ever flown Alaska before? I know they don't fly to the Midwest as
I
much.
have Well, actually they do. They opened a connection to Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky like 2 months ago, I think. 3 months ago. Um but, I've never flown Alaska. I've only ever been to, Seattle once, the West Coast twice. Um and also, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's not great for, you know, one of the hosts of Transit Talk to have gone almost a year without even flying.
I mean, it's totally understandable, especially with COVID. But when it comes to flying, like I mentioned in on my Instagram, I was really impressed by Alaska, and I am much more encouraged to fly them more often. Because
I've actually, can you believe it? I've actually never flown a U.S. airline that's not one of the big three.
so,
Now that I
so
think
you haven't
about
even
it,
flown Southwest.
never flown South. Well, for starters, Southwest is like a sham low cost carrier because like they're like, oh, $50 anywhere, and then you actually check the prices and it's like 600, and it's like, okay, well now, but I have not flown Southwest.
Yeah,
The closest, actually, the closest I've ever gone to flying was Frontier, because we were considering as a family going to like Denver or Las Vegas via Frontier because they have a pretty good presence in Cincinnati, but alas.
that's so interesting because at least on the West Coast, I for much of my life rarely ever flew on any of the big three because we would nearly always fly Southwest everywhere at least because they tend to have
Yeah,
they
cause
tend to have their lowest fares here.
you guys have everything. You guys have Frontier, have Allegiant, have Southwest, have Alaska. You've even flown a Velo, like new kiddo.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because but I mean nowadays my parents have more frequent flyer miles and other travel points, so we've been able to fly Delta at least more often when we go to Utah. But and also like you mentioned, Southwest is getting more expensive, so we have to search for other options.
I'm just trying to recall the westernmost airport into which I've flown to was Dallas, Texas, and that was for a layover.
Oh, and that and
Other than that,
because you've been to the West Coast, but had only driven there, right?
yeah, we're a driving family. Well, because it's just you can't let go of the convenience. Able to go anywhere whenever you land. Also, you can bring absolutely everything. Bring all the clothes or all the whatever else you want in a car, right? Even if it means driving 30-40 hours.
Yeah, and you can go to a lot of the more remote places too that would be way more expensive to fly to.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess, it's oftentimes it's just the big scary cost of plane tickets right off the bat, right? But where you're driving, it's more gradual. You feel like you're making the spending is deserved. Whereas if it's like a plane ticket, boom, right, $400, $500, $600 if you're flying Southwest.
And if you're not an app geek like us, then the plane is really just not something that's worth money. It's just like a way of getting somewhere.
Well, I mean, it's not it's not that I obviously love airplanes, but it's the driving, it's real Americano. Take to the roads.
Yeah, and it's interesting because and there's a lot of times where maybe driving couldn't be an option if we had more train connections too, because it'd be much easier to have that same level of at least being able to bring a lot more with you than if you're on a plane.
Actually, hold on. I believe I've asked you this before, but I keep forgetting. What's the longest road trip, like longest drive that you've ever undertaken?
If I recall correctly, so I've done the drive from San Diego to San Francisco a couple times, and that's like 8 or 9 hours depending on traffic. Um, and then I've driven from Mammoth Lakes to San Diego, which is about 8 hours too. So I believe that's the longest. I haven't gone farther than that.
Have you ever driven like San Francisco to Salt Lake City?
I haven't, and I really want to. And I was going to this past November. We were gonna drive.
Oh, really?
To St. George and then up to Salt Lake City, but then we didn't do that because of COVID. But someday I hope to.
Really? Because I drove that. That's the route I took. Like right when I met with you in, what was it? When did we meet up? July. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the route I took. Like the last leg of the journey, it was the direct Salt Lake City to San Francisco, 10 hours. It's really nice,
Yeah.
Especially the western part, like when you get west of Great Salt Lake and you have all the Bunville salt flats and all that. That's really cool.
Yeah, my dad has done that a lot. Because whenever we go to Utah, usually in the winter, we fly and then he would drive because we usually bring our dog. So of course we can't bring our dog on the plane.
I see. Well, actually talking about today's topic, however, well, first of all, Jack, let me ask you this: Have you ever been to China?
I've not been to mainland China. I've been to Hong Kong and I've been to Macau, but I've not been to anywhere north of those borders. And I've also never transited either at an airport. So no.
Okay. Yeah, I've never been there either, except for 5 times also being born there. But today, what we're actually going to do is let's talk about rail transit in China, which well, first of all, as everybody knows, right? It's talked about in the news all the time, especially in comparison to the United States, right? They're like, oh, China has over what is the exact number, right? Like lots and lots. What is the exact number?
But
One. Sorry.
I,
Basically a lot of rail development, right? And it's been very rapid,
yeah,
especially when compared to the relative stagnance, the stagnant development of high speed rail in the United States. Um, so I mean, I certainly have experience on both the normal trains as well as the high speed rail. I want to know, Jack, as someone who has not experienced it, what are your impressions of it first?
well, I would first point out that I'm very jealous of the rapid development and the ease of which they've been able to put in so many of these lines in only like 13 years. Uh, in comparison, we haven't built anything since the Acela in 2000. That's not even high speed rail. So on one hand, I'm really jealous of what it's like. I don't actually know just like how good the infrastructure is itself, like if it's on time or whatnot. It seems to be equatable to Japan in terms of its cleanliness and its safety and its on time performance. So it seems uh, great to me. Of course, I haven't experienced it at all. What's it like as someone who's traveling on it or in using it?
Well, actually, I guess that's we can start off by talking about comparisons with other countries, right? So you did mention Japan, and yes, obviously, the high speed rail development is pretty much on par with that of Japan. It's fast, yeah, and it is on time generally, though it's not to the same extent of Japan, because Japan's another level, right? If it's delayed 5 seconds, they'll give everybody apology cards. No, it's not like that, but it's also not Amtrak 10-hour delays,
Mhm.
well, 10 hours generous, maybe like 27 hours. I don't know. So that's the high speed road, which is quite extensive. Like if you look at a map, right, it is extremely extensive. I believe that the I don't know. I believe the extent of Chinese. Well, no, it's not. I believe the Chinese high speed rail network, like the distance it covers, is like more than the. Well, it's definitely more than that of Japan's. It's more than any country in the world, right?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, it's I all the times I've took it, I thought it was a particularly comfortable experience. Although I will say I have also taken the non high speed rail trains, and they are just normal trains. They're not any. They're nothing special. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, certainly my impressions was that the non high speed trains were just there, but of course China has uh I believe 146,000 kilometers of total rail. So there's a lot of there's an extensive network of non high speed trains. Of course, they're not.
Well, yeah. I mean, you'll see. Like, if you look at a map, right, that's when you'll see the differences to be plainly visible. You can see that obviously, the population of China is very very unequally distributed. Um, you can probably see like there's basically the line from the northeast to the southwest of China, splitting the country in about half, and you can tell which half is the densely populated one, right? Um, the other half almost has nothing, and has no high speed rail infrastructure almost at all, which is basically Western China as well as the Northeast. But amongst the large cities of the East and the South, it's very developed.
And I'm curious. You mentioned that you've been on the high speed rail a lot. Which routes did you use it on, and how long were those
That
routes?
is a good question. I'm gonna try and see if I can name them all. So I have been on the high speed rail from, let's see, I've been on the high speed rail from Shanghai to Nanjing the first time I went back. Second time I went back, I let's see, it's gonna be all jumbled. Never mind. But I will say I've Shanghai to Nanjing. I've been on from um Beijing to let's see, shoot Beijing to Xi'an. I've been that Xi'an and back. I've been on from Shanghai to Nanning, which is like in the south of China. I've taken it from where else have I taken it from? Other place, Changsha, which is in Hunan, to Beijing, and also Changsha to Nanjing. But it's basically a lot of trips. The longest one I took was the Shanghai to Nanning one, which was for 8 hours. which can give you an impression of how extensive the network is because you know 8 hours on it's a high speed rail, right? So it goes a long distance at what was it about 200 250 miles per hour kilometers per hour, I'm sorry. um so yeah, that's it's very extensive. Much like how the Japanese Shinkansen, the Japanese high speed rail system, it covers it covers most of the country. But it is not, there's still definitely lots of places that don't have that sort of infrastructure. And also because it's expensive, right? It's like 3 or 4 times more expensive than the normal train, which makes it just not feasible for a large part of the population.
When you say expensive, do you mean in terms of construction costs or in like the fares? Because at least from
A ticket.
because when I was
I'm
looking
sorry.
watching videos, it said that many of the fares were a quarter of what the cost is for other nations, like Shinkansen prices, which
Oh, well, yeah, yeah. Well, compared to other countries, it's obviously cheaper. Like let's see, the one I took, the 8 hour one, that was about 240 Chinese yuan, which is about 37 bucks. So compared with other countries, it's amazing, astonishingly cheap. But compared to the other trains in China, it's astonishingly expensive. That's what I mean. There we go.
yeah, that would make sense. Because it mentioned also in the video I was watching that many of these high speed trains are continually losing money and profit because they charge, I guess, equitably low fares. But it allows for more accessibility, obviously, and of course, uh, I think the Chinese average income is a lot lower than Japan, which would probably explain the lower
Hmm.
prices. But it at least is significantly cheaper than the Shinkansen, which for I believe 8 hours would be probably over $200.
Yeah, I mean, especially like you can see, for example, right? The most unprofitable one is the one that goes out west to Urumqi, right? The that connects the rail systems out east to the one in Urumqi, which the purposes of that, it can be debated, but suffice to say, right? It's like I believe I saw, I think it was Wendover Productions that put in a video. The comparison would be like if there were a high speed train built between Salt Lake City and Seattle, right? People would use it, but certainly not enough to justify its cost, especially when there's like nothing significant in between, you know?
Yeah, and I mean I don't know if freight traffic can use the same line or not, but I guess from maybe like a geographical equity standpoint, if all of the development is concentrated in one part of the country, then that would leave like the Xinjiang region behind. And sorry if I'm butchering any of these pronunciations, but I mean, I know there's obviously a lot of political backstory around the line and whether they want to like continue their ethnic cleansing operations and whatnot, but at least from a geographical standpoint, it's probably good in the long term to have at least some economic connections through these high-speed rails, so there's not a lot of like economic inequality within the country, which I think we've seen in other countries, and it's not been productive.
Yeah, I mean, especially you can also see that with, well, not a high speed rail line. The high speed rail is to Xinjiang Urumqi, but also with the Qinghai Tibet Railway to and from Lhasa, and the new extension to Shigatsu. It's a tremendous journey, suffice to say, right? It goes literally through the Himalayas, and it's a magnificent ride. I have not been on the route itself, but I have been in close proximity of it. Um, it's before the line was constructed in, I want to say, 2006. Um, there was no connection rail wise to and from Tibet at all. And you can still see on a map there's no connection other than that one line. So it has been tremendous in bringing in passengers, in bringing in that additional economic connection who aren't reliant on having to drive their car for 40 hours or having to just book a plane in, especially given the super high altitude. They say for that line especially, right? They say that the train is the optimal form of transport because it gives you that slow, gradual increase to get adjusted into the high altitude. If you take a plane, it's like wham, right? Boom, and then as soon as you get off, it's like, oh, will you develop sickness? Like, will you drop dead on the floor? Who knows? But economic development is pretty key there as well.
And also the plane point you made is interesting because from what I could understand and tell from the research, supposedly the Chinese airspace in general is really prone to delays and according to like in 2014, apparently 1/3 of all domestic flights in mainland China did not depart on time. So uh, it seems like a lot of the reason for this train development and also high speed train development, of course, the train to Tibet is not high speed, but like a lot of the development is brought on by the fact that the plane, even if it might be faster in some cases, is not very reliable anymore.
Yeah, I mean that is a good point. As more people, especially with large populations, plane can't account for all of that. Just like in, for example, well, the United States kind of gets around that because it doesn't have that sort of large population. But like for example, India, right, where we're both the train and the plane systems are sort of overcrowded, shall we say. Um, and so the planes often experience delays. The Indian government is also trying to advance train technology as much as possible. I guess in my experience, Chinese planes, there have certainly been delays, but hey, it pushes rail development, which is it's definitely um it's definitely, I guess one of the positives of having not so amazing aviation.
And speaking of development, maybe for a minute we could just think about like this development is obviously is way much more advanced and accelerated than any other country that is even pushed for rail projects, and it's obviously tremendously different circumstances. With like the
Hmm.
extraordinary demand with all these cities over 5 million people, like just
Hmm.
way more demand than normal. But the system of governance is also different, and I'm curious what you think on what kind of factors would allow for this development to be so advanced and rapid, and is it even like can you replicate it anywhere else?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's. I think this one, that's definitely a good question to ask, and the answer is really applicable to so many different things, right? So the difference between the Chinese system of government and other places is one that we all understand but don't really think much about the implications. So the Chinese government is obviously authoritarian, one party rule, limited regional authority, no no elections too, right? Um, which certainly has its negatives, but it also has its positives, which some people, usually don't consider. The positives being that because there is no real opposition, if the government is to put projects to good use, for example, developing railroads, then it can do that without any opposition, as we see, for example, in the United States, right? Um, in the United States, whenever there's a new rail project, however significant or insignificant or completely overhaul or just the most minor of additions, it gets bogged down in so much paperwork and opposition and debates and all this and that and this and that. And as soon as and before you know it, your term's over, right? I'm sure you're keenly aware of this because of California's rail project, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but the Chinese system, right? Because there's none of that, they have freedom to do all of that just with a snap of a finger, right? I guess it's also the same situation with, for example, coronavirus, right? Um, there's you can talk whether or not about any other implications, but one thing that it does have, one good aspect of it is that the government is able to quickly and easily shut everything down, which is not something which can be replicated in the United States, right? Um, and again, I'm not saying that this is intrinsically a better system, there are definitely downsides, which are often and prevalently pointed out. But in terms of instituting rail projects, that's a main reason why it's been so successful, and has been developing so rapidly, right? Without much opposition to any of the rail projects. So I guess in terms of that question, do you think it can be replicated? There's really, if there is no like hard overarching government policy, I think, then there really has to be a real legitimate collective mindset of change, right? For
Yeah.
example, in Japan, a democratic government, a collective mindset of the need for trains, right? Um, Commercially, however, I guess it has also been replicated in Russia, where the government runs and opens a bunch of different services, not because intrinsically democracy or whatever, but because the government has the authority to do that. Although I will say their needs are probably different than that of China's.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if this is the question that is made all the time, right? Can something like China be made in the U.S.? And that's certainly my answer. I think that the United States doesn't exactly have that collective mindset. But what do you think? Especially, do you think that sort of the Chinese system of rail development can be replicated in the U.S.?
Well, I think it's funny because a lot of politicians in the U.S. apparently think they can replicate it. I know Pete Buttigieg said when he took office that he wants to see America leading the world in high-speed rail, which we have a long way to go to get like 70,000 kilometers in 20 years, which I believe is what China's going to have by then. And I think
Well,
yeah.
Well, first of all, the United States. It doesn't. The United States. The the, the United States, the entirety of the U.S. high-speed rail network is smaller than it's smaller than I think what it is like, it's like not even like a quarter of the Japanese length, which is like 10 times, a billion times smaller than the U.S.
Yeah.
Right?
I don't even think it's that much. Because technically it's zero because our trains aren't even high speed. But
Oh yeah.
it's like
Wait, it's like smaller than is it smaller than Uzbekistan?
it might be
Mm,
because the distance
it
alone
might be.
between because the Afrosiyab keeps expanding. I believe it goes to Bukhara now, which would be if you count the line from Tashkent to Samarkand and to Bukhara, it's probably just longer than New York to Boston alone.
Wait, hold on. This calls for investigation. Acela route. The Acela route is 457 miles. The Afrosiyab is 200. Okay, well, I guess the United States has a larger rail network than Uzbekistan. So, maybe. Okay. But it's that's a funny joke. What, you know.
Yeah, and back to my answer. I think it's going to be really, really, really difficult to even get future projects in place. Of course, it's, right now it seems like the best course of action is for private operators to put in place because our government seems to have very little efficacy in doing I guess multi state projects or convincing conservatives who want this local government enforcement. But even on the private company side of things, it's still incredibly difficult to put projects in place for a lot of reasons. I think China benefits from, a couple things. One being that eminent domain is not as big of an issue. I was in one of the videos I was watching. Apparently, 20% of high-speed rail costs, both in the U.S. and in the U.K., have been on eminent domain and relocating people. Which just geographically, a lot of the tracks I believe in China don't go through heavily populated areas, at least for most of it, which doesn't necessitate moving people around. But also the labor costs, they were much cheaper, just from paying lower wages and I guess making the materials imports a lot cheaper. So there's a lot of construction costs that just them being low in the first place makes it, I guess, cheaper to put these projects in place. So there's a lot of I think the political factors are going to be much more of a challenge to overcome in the future, because labor costs are I guess increasing wages, but with automation and economies of scale, they'll be offset a bit. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how there's just so much local opposition, especially from those like NIMBY people and then the
Mm-hmm.
Midwest who really don't want anything being built through their farms, even if it's
Yeah.
a oil pipeline or a high speed rail. Like I don't know. Maybe we could upgrade track infrastructure, like all the freight train track we have. We do have the longest network of railways in the world with like 150,000 kilometers. And if we can upgrade that to high speed rail, maybe, but we can't really build new rail lines.
Yeah. I like it's like I said, right? It's bogged down in debate, and as soon as you know it, your term's over, right? It's time. People have had enough of you. It's time to vote for the other party who has, very very different thoughts on public transit than you, right? Um, but yeah, I mean, it's. I guess it's remarkable that if you look at the Chinese network, it provides service to so many different places. There's almost no major center. Well, I'm sorry, there is no major center that is unserviced. It even provides service to like the most remote of places, right? Not to transit somewhere, but to not because it's trying to get somewhere more important, but because it's serving those small connections, which is sort of what the United States had in say the 1950s, 60s, no earlier, 1930s, 40s, 50s, right? Um, like how for now the United States has the long distance routes that cut across the country. Well, the places they're serving in between aren't exactly. It's not. They're not intentionally serving them, right? They're serving them because they're on the way to the West Coast or the East Coast. Contrastly, though, China, if you look at the West or the Northeast, you'll see that they have independent branches going to all sorts of teeny small towns. So it's really it's really a question of how much how much will there is, right? Like you said, but also how much does it play into the unity of the country, which is another interesting thing because the Chinese government will proudly proclaim that a lot of these lines are for building unity, national unity, which is not something that for example, the United States really takes pride of, right? Like, oh, you'll never hear in the U.S. people say, "Hey, let's well, you never hear, the United States as a whole say, okay, we're building a new rail line that's going to increase the national unity of our country, right? People don't really think much about that,
Yeah, it's
which,
all very state based.
right, exactly, exactly. People want as much autonomy as possible. Um, get the filthy feds out, sort of sentiment.
Yeah, it seems like at least in the U.S., there's some sense of unity, maybe in the Cascadia region at least, because there's a lot of concerted efforts to build like this Cascadia rail network from Portland to Vancouver, which uh, would be great if it happens, but it's just one of those other projects that's probably gonna take 20 years to plan, get those environmental documents. It's actually interesting because at least high speed rail has a lot of environmental impact, both positively and negatively. And in construction wise, that's another huge barrier that it's much harder to overcome in the U.S. than in China, which is that uh, building bridges and tunnels really takes a lot of energy and it destroys a lot of environments, which I think there's a lot more regulation of in the U.S. than in China.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, so I actually do want to change topics a bit, if I may, and I want to talk about the connections that China has to other countries. So, for reference, China borders 14 countries by land. Part of the border is made up of inhospitable Gobi Desert. Part of the border is made up of inhospitable Himalayan mountains, and also part of the border, I guess, is also like inhospitable ocean. Does that count?
Sure, I guess I could get that.
Maybe. Sure. But so obviously the United States has connections with Canada and Mexico. Actually, I want to start off by talking actually about latest news, which is that I believe just yesterday, as we record, um, a new a new railway link, the first cross river railway bridge actually between China and Russia has been completed, which in retrospect is kind of surprising because you would expect like them to have a ton already, right? Especially given the close relationship between the governments. But because the Russian Far East and the Chinese Northeast are not super big centers of population, it has taken until now. And the new bridge it links the Chinese city of Tongjiang with the Russian city of Nizhny or however you say it. But it basically crosses the Amur River, and it's one of the new sort of connections, right? That as people say, right, hopefully will bring new economic development, new connections, shorter travel times between the two countries, and unity and links and all of that.
Yeah, and I think what's critical is that from what I can tell, is that it's now the fourth border crossing between China and Russia.
Right.
But
Yeah.
geographically, it saves significant time. Apparently, it's up to 10 hours. Between like the northeast part of China and Moscow, because now instead of what I believe they used to just go towards the Vladivostok area, by in the very far like northeast, like very like near the Vladivostok area border. Uh, you
Actually, I don't believe there is a rail connection in the far. I think what had to happen before was that the people from like the Chinese Northeast had to travel all the way down to Beijing to get on the Trans-Mongolian,
yeah,
if I'm
it's
not
interesting
mistaken.
because it appears on Google Maps there uh is a connection in like Sui Fenhe, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm probably not, but it does appear that the tracks cross the border at like the Rasi Pnaya area in Russia. So I believe, and it claims that it would save 809 kilometers of getting to Moscow from uh from Tongjiang in 10 hours. So it
From
appears that
basically Manchuria.
yeah. So it appears it does save significant time, which it would anyway, even if
Mm-hmm.
that other connection didn't exist. But
Right. But yeah, I mean, people would be able to traverse the border right then and there, which is certainly good for most in the region. And it's really interesting. I actually have a friend who like traveled all the way up to the Russian border by train. It was in the city of well, not the city, the the town of Mohe, Mohe, and it is super remote. In that area of the country is that area is super remote for both China and Russia, um, and it's interesting because the river is right there. You would think that there would be lots of connections, but there's actually like very few, especially when compared. Russia has more connections with Finland, right? Despite the Russian and Chinese government being so much closer politically, um, which I guess just shows you how remote and inhospitable that is. Um, but speaking of remote and inhospitable, you know what other country China has rail connection to?
I heard they have Vietnam, but I don't know if that's what you're going for.
Okay, well, Vietnam, but you know what other country?
Kazakhstan?
Actually, no, because there's no Chinese rail line that goes out there, eh?
Is there not? I don't know.
Well, no, because if you look at, actually, no, I'm sorry. Yes, there is. Um, Going out west from Urumqi, but well, the interesting one is North Korea, right?
Is there? So you're saying there's no connection, or is there one?
No, there is. It's
That's what I thought.
North Korea
Yeah.
has a rail line. Yeah, and I don't know if you've seen online, right? Like the people, well, most people do is they fly into Pyongyang from Beijing, but there's also a rail link through the city of Dandong on the river, and it takes from there it's like 2 hours to Pyongyang, um, which is pretty interesting, right? Not every country has, well, two countries in the world have rail links to Korea, if we don't include the secret rail line that goes under the DMZ. Um, but it is certainly most accessible from China to and from Pyongyang,
And wasn't
which
wasn't that the
is
same route that Kim Jong Un used to get to the Singapore summit, or did he? Because
oh
he
yeah,
he took the train there, right?
yeah, because actually no, to Singapore, no, he took the train to Vietnam, because
Oh yeah, that's
yeah,
right. Yeah, it
because
was the first summit. Yeah, yeah, or second one. Yeah,
right, he flew to Singapore because Malaysia angry, um, Malaysia angry because they assassinated Kim Jong Un's brother Kim Jong Nam in the
yeah,
Kuala
yeah.
Lumpur International Airport, which is pretty funny, I guess. Um, but other than that, there's obviously the Trans-Mongolian across Mongolia, and there are rail links to Vietnam. There are rail links to. There's actually a rail line in construction between China and Nepal, which will be the first, I guess, sort of trans trans Himalayan, like international Himalayan route. Um, it's it's construction in progress. It has been put in place, which is is certainly a very interesting prospect.
Yeah, because that
Um,
is there any way to avoid any of the him? I mean, I guess you could build tunnels and whatnot, but those are like 18,000, 25,000
I
per
mean,
hour.
you know what you can do?
What's that?
Go across them, go across them.
Do
Go, I'm sorry, I used the wrong word. Go around them.
and do you know what the route is for this? The at least the Nepal China connection.
Actually, let me have a look at that. So the one from Nepal, well, obviously in Nepal it would be Kathmandu. Yeah, Kathmandu to Shigatse in Tibet, which is as of right now the extent of the Chinese rail system in Tibet itself. But they say that this from Shigatse to Kathmandu, it will be actually only 45 miles, or 72 kilometers, which is not a lot. But remember, this is like the highest of the highest Himalayan. Mount Everest is literally right next door. So,
Yeah, I mean, I'm having a hard time imagining how they're possibly going to build something like this, but of course the
oh, it
Chinese.
actually says expected to be completed by 2022.
Oh wow, yeah, that's
Oh, check this out. 98.5% of the section will be bridges or tunnels.
yeah. I mean,
Oh, that's for the Nepali side. I'm sorry. Yeah.
but I mean, all things considered, that's crazy. Just not how quick they're able to do it, the type of terrain they're able to cross. I mean, it's taken us hundreds of years to get like tunnels in place across, like some I guess the passes that'd be considered lame by these standards. I mean, it really puts into perspective just how astonishing the development of rail systems has been in China and even in Nepal too.
Hmm. Well, actually, you know what's interesting? If that line is completed, well, if and when that line is completed, um, because then rail service will be commenced from China to and from Kathmandu. You know where there's service to and from Kathmandu?
Can you go to India?
India, yeah, exactly. Um, Although I don't know the situation now because the the Nepali, yeah, actually, yeah, yeah, actually, I'm sorry. You cannot go to Kathmandu yet. You can't once this line is, I'm sorry, once this line is completed, you will be able to go to and from China and Kathmandu. But surprisingly, Nepal Railways has actually not operating is not operating to and from Kathmandu. They are only operating from India, from the border town in India to another town in Nepal. So you'll have to transit a bit, but that does leave open a very real possibility of being able to have China India service across the Himalayas via Nepal.
Yeah, which is also just like equally astonishing. I mean, it's also I guess just a part of the larger OBOR One Belt One Road strategy from China to have more.
Well, I don't think India's very happy about that. Um, but actually, I will say that there actually has been talks between both China and India about another another proposed rail link, which would connect Kolkata in India with Kunming in southern China via Myanmar, which I think would be really amazing because it would go through some of the most, I don't know, some of the most perhaps not not famous places in the world, including Northeast India, northern Nepal, and southern and southwestern China. Um, if that line would open, I would be taking that like all day. It seems so cool.
Yeah, and I think the Myanmar portion is equally important and infamous, not necessarily infamous, but like getting people through and into Myanmar would be huge for I guess international recognition and tourism and those kinds of purposes.
Yeah, I mean, because the region is like super remote still, all parts of it, right? Like southwestern, even compared to with China, you'll see that there's a decent gap in service in the province of Yunnan, which is in the south. There's not a lot of service there. Northern Myanmar, there's almost nothing, and the Seven Sisters of Northeast India is by far the least developed region of the country. So having that sort of rail line to promote greater unity among the region and not to the respective governments, right? Even though regions of all three countries are contained within a very small radius, each the regions of each country have more connections with New Delhi or with Beijing or with Naypyidaw in Myanmar than they do with each other, which I think would be a wonderful thing if a rail line were built.
Yeah, and it I guess to me it just brings up questions more. Like I mentioned the OBR, and of course a lot of these countries have problems with it. But for Chinese purposes, at least even on domestic lines, most of the usage seems to be limited in some cases. And I wonder like whether these because they traverse harsh climates, they're probably very curvy, so they're not probably the most time like efficient routes. And I wonder like what is the primary purpose then? Like, is it meant for connectivity or is it really more meant for political purposes?
I mean, there's definitely both in there, but I would definitely say, I would personally say that connectivity is a huge part, because there's a Chinese saying. What is the Chinese saying? I forgot the Chinese saying. It's something along the lines of, to wait, hold on, what is it? To basically something along the lines of to grow the economy, to develop, right? To have development, build a road, right? Because once you have connections, then all the other things start to come with it, right? Which is a principle which has been tried and tested, and we've seen the results of it all across the world. But I political purposes are what they are, but I think connectivity as well as ensuring the price is affordable for the locals is also super important, which you can't really do if you just leave it to bland, which if you just leave it to intrinsic capitalism, right? It wouldn't be possible. So the government is taking a pretty steep loss in some of these routes. But to ensure that the fare prices are affordable for the people, especially given how large the gap is between the wages of the people who live in the big city and the people who live in the rural parts of the country, that's more important.
Yeah, and even just the gap between China and some of these other countries in terms of its wages and GDP per capita is still is staggering. But it's also interesting that a lot of this Chinese development, I mean, of course, it's been going on consistently for the last 13 years, but a lot of it was kickstarted in the aftermath of the Great Recession in the hopes that it would restart the economy. And of course, now we're in a similar situation, albeit not as bad, but with a lot of economic harm across many countries. And as you pointed out earlier, China has managed to escape a lot of the effects of COVID through strict measures, but India and I think Nepal to some extent have fared worse. And of course, maybe it is driven by political purposes, but at least connections and access to more economic centers would be huge for those countries, even if they can't get, I guess, a high fare box recovery from the people paying the fare. But economically, the investment could be huge.
Hmm. So I want to, for this last portion, I want to actually talk a little bit about, less grandiose things. Because I have actually had the opportunity one time to take a long distance non high speed rail line, non high speed, like just a normal train rail line in China, which was a 21-hour ride from the city of Nanjing in the east to the city of Xining. It's spelled Xining, in western China. So it's like just on the border of the Tibetan plateau. Um, so it's like as it was just close enough to actually have the Tibetan, the Western feel. Um, and so I sort of want to talk a little bit about that, and especially since Jack, you have also been on long distance trains. I really want to have sort of have a little comparison, see what they're like. Because I have not been on a long distance train in the United States. Well, first of all, um, so it was a 21 hour ride. It could have been longer if we had went all the way to Tibet, but unfortunately we were not able to. Um, but we basically left. So the first afternoon, we left around 5, and then went the whole of, and then just traveled for like the whole of the next day. Actually, no, I'm sorry. It wasn't around 5. It was like much later. It was like 7, 8, 9, and then traveled basically for the entirety of the next day, until arriving at like in the afternoon, in the evening again, and throughout that entire journey, it was sort of a landscape change from the villages of the east as gradually went out west, became more desert and became more mountainous.
Hmm.
Um, but I sort of want to talk about like the feel. So, Jack, did you ride in coach or did you ride in did you have like a room when you took the Empire Builder, was it?
Yeah, I've actually never been on long distance coach. I've been in a roomette and I've been in a family bedroom.
Ah, okay. Well, I was in coach the whole time. Um Hence, it was very, 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 very crowded. Um, Basically, the Chinese seat arrangement it was sort of like having table styles of like you know seats, not in a row but like facing each other, and so it was 3 seats to 3 seats, 3 seats to 3 seats, 3 seats to 3 seats on both sides, right? Um, which certainly made it was much more packed. It was very, very much packed. Like in the initial routes, there were some people even standing because they were just taking the train for like 3 hours or something and then getting off.
Hmm.
So you can imagine what kind of environment that was, especially since the AC wasn't the best. Everybody wants food. Everybody has body odors, and all of that. So it wasn't the most luxurious experience. But I suppose Amtrak is not like that. Eh?
Yeah. Uh, I guess the seats on Amtrak, I mean, they're nice and they have a lot of legroom, but they are pretty dated, and I would imagine that's not really the case for these services. But what was the price like? Is it good value? Because I know Amtrak is always debated. It's super expensive, but it is a 40+ hour trip, and you get nice views. You get food included. You get a flat bed. So what's the value like on these trips?
The 20-hour train ride for that ticket for the non-high speed rail, I paid the equivalent of $52.
And do you think that was worth it, or would you have preferred to just fly?
Oh, me? For me, I absolutely loved it because transit,
Yeah.
right? But also trains, right? But also, oh hey, we're going to the west, right? Which is not something which people get to do a lot. If we were to take the high speed rail, well, first of all, well, it was existent at that time, but it would have cost probably like 3 times more. if we were to take a plane, it would have cost probably the same amount, right? Um, but I think I think it's much nicer to take the train because especially in China, it's not empty. Just it doesn't immediately become empty, right? You pass you pass village upon village upon village, which is sort of another primary purpose of having these slower trains, even though high speed rail is around, right? High speed rail isn't going to stop everywhere. Um, that's what the purpose of these smaller normal trains are, right? There are lots of people who got off at very very remote stations, um, stations where there wasn't even a station building. It was just on the side of there was just a platform and then immediately the tiny village, right? So it was really cool to see all that, especially since so many places are so many places were how to say so many places were just not talked about a lot, right? Which I guess is sort of the feeling on Amtrak long distance rail as well. Although, well, a lot of things. For example, we also didn't there was also not no Wi-Fi on board, um, which sort of adds to the experience.
Hmm. And what's the frequency like? I mean, I would imagine like overnight trains probably only run once a night, but are there any? Is it just one train per day? Like, do the towns that have or intermediate stops, do they have other routes that serve them too?
Actually, yeah. Well, it obviously depends on the tiny town, but it's certainly nothing like the United States, where like, oh, if it's a month, if there's only certain lines going to and from, right? But in China, it's actually an interesting thing. It's called what is it called? Basically, the principle where the entirety of China has eight horizontal lines and eight vertical lines, like big corridors per se, right? Corridors of development, and with the big cities, obviously they have, it's like tons and tons and tons of trains every single day. Smaller towns will definitely have much more. Um, will definitely have much more than what you see in the United States, right? But even the rural villages, they'll definitely have them, 2 days at the very very least, every 2 days at the very very least. The frequency is very good, although it does certainly depend on which routes you're taking and to and from where and whether or not you have to transfer, which actually is becoming more and more rare just because of the number of like direct routes that are being formulated by the rail system.
Yeah, and the last thing I want to consider in this regard is like, was this train line and are most of the trains electrified? Because I know that like in China at least, they have a very high percentage of the lines electrified. I think it's close to 70%, which is really, I believe, way more than any other country. Which I think is equally impressive as just the building of the lines themselves. Because if you can save carbon emissions while also having all these services, that's obviously a win-win.
Yeah, I mean, actually, most of them are electrified. Because if you have development everywhere, it's not too hard to have the train also run on local electric cables, right? It's not like it's not like because most of the country is not you know barren wasteland where you have to have explicitly put up electric cables for the entirety of the route. But obviously that still happens in like western routes and all that, right? So for example, the route to and from Lhasa in Tibet, that is obviously not electrified, and you'll never be able to guess the reason why. um Totally doesn't have anything to do with the mountains, but I mean they are conducting feasibility studies. um it's That's also, I guess, a work in progress, right? Much of the infrastructure in the east, the developed east, is certainly electrified, but it's nothing like the United States, where we have beautiful, beautiful diesel um, consuming trains running like almost the majority of routes.
Yeah, it seems at this point like, and the freight trains too. Like the passenger rail is obviously
Yeah,
well, but
yeah.
like there's no electrified pass or freight rail at all in the U.S., which is equally problematic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly much better. There's really no sort of comparison as of right now to what the Chinese rail network, because you can compare individually with Japan, Korea, and Europe, but the problem is those are all smaller countries, right? It's not too hard to connect all of Germany just because there's not a lot to connect intrinsically, right? Um, you know, China's the size of the United States, but yeah, I think we've hammered enough at the point that you can't compare the two, right?
And even in India, which has a similar population, they of course do have an extensive railway network, one that may be worth talking about in a later episode. But
Stay
it's
tuned.
obviously they have far less high speed rail, and it's almost a lot of it is still diesel trains. So they've got a long way to go to catch up to the infrastructure that China has. But in terms of services, it might be similar.
Yeah, stay tuned for that episode. I mean, I will certainly have to look more into it, but the Indian railways are very rich, both in their history and their present and in their future.
Yeah, and otherwise, that is it for this episode on Chinese rail. As we've mentioned, it's very unmatched and very technologically leading in a lot of different categories and factors. So hopefully you all enjoyed hearing about the quirks of the system. And stay tuned for our next episode on Friday.